Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us tonight on In Focus. Now, there are calls for all parties to refrain from the use of violence. This as 7 protesters were reportedly killed on Monday by Sudanese forces. These latest killings bring the death toll of protesters to now 71 since the army took over power from civilian authority in October. Joining me now to talk about this is Vincent Obisie-Orlu, researcher at Good Governance Africa. Vincent, good to be with you tonight here on In Focus. Would you call what is happening in Sudan a crackdown on anti-coup protesters?
Well, definitely there's a crackdown happening on protesters for return to democracy in Sudan by the military government.
Yeah. What is behind the call by the organizers of these protests to announce a 2-day strike and civil disobedience?
So the situation in Sudan begins with the ousting of Omar al-Bashir in 2019. And during that time, after he was ousted, the military came and took over. Following that, there was a series of protests for a civilian transition, and it resulted in the military cracking down on these civilian protesters, as well as it ending in Ethiopia and the African Union resolving and supporting a transitional council in which the military and the democratic transition movement came together to form a government of national unity. However, that government of national unity eventually broke down with the coup that occurred in late October, which had former Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok arrested and kept under house arrest. And as a result of this now, even after the Prime Minister was returned to power, he signed an agreement which basically made him subordinate to the Transitional Council, the Military Transitional Council, and gave the power to them, and later resigned. Now protesters are in the streets requesting and demanding a return to allow their democratic aspirations to be realized and the reversal of the coup.
Now, why is the military not acceding to the calls by the people for a civilian government?
Well, on one hand, there's a lot of anxiety about the fact that many of these military officials might be tried and prosecuted for war crimes they committed during the Darfur crisis in the early 2000s. So that is one issue and one aspect. But also the military is not willing to give up control of this country. In many ways, if you have been the military in power, you will not be willing to voluntarily surrender and return control to the civilian population.
Now, the U.S. State Department spokesperson, concerned, of course, about the reports of escalating violence, tweeted this, that it would establish an anti-terrorism force to counter potential threats. What should we read to that? There was not much elaboration following that.
Well, the situation in Sudan is very important for the U.S. You see, when Sudan returned to the international community, the U.S. and many countries removed a number of the sanctions on the country. And as a result of that, Sudan has gained a lot of credibility from its engagement with the Abraham Accords to its recent opening up to a number of development partnership agreements for the exploration of resources in the country. So definitely the U.S. is going to have an interest in keeping an eye on what's happening in Sudan and state that to prevent terrorism, which the government is claiming, the military government is claiming that it's doing this in defense of the country from terrorist activities. So the U.S. is going to keep an eye on this to prevent any potential terrorist activities, as well as to try and nudge the military government into coming back into agreements for the transition.
What will it take to break the deadlock between the military leaders and the pro-democracy civilian groups so that, of course, a risk of war here is averted?
I don't think that there's a risk of war per se in this situation. However, I do think that in order for the situation to move forward, the aspirations of protesters for democratic transition will need to be adhered to by the government, by the military government. As a result, this requires the military government to be cognizant of the fact that the people have been demanding for a democratic transition for years now, and anything less where the military is put in its rightful role as the defender of national security and in support of the democratic government, is not going to be fully accepted by the people. It comes back to a question of governance, good governance. At Good Governance Africa, we describe good governance as the authoritative allocation of resources, who gets what, when, where, and how. Now, important to this is a question of accountability and transparency. Under military governments such as this, there is no accountability or transparency. The protesters are demanding and making demands for accountability and transparency, which requires the military government to open itself, to step down from being in control of the state, to allow civilian rule to come back.
Is there a time frame that we can put in place for the maybe conclusion of the talks between the parties and a setting of a path to elections?
At present, I don't see a specific time frame. We're going to have to wait and see how this plays out. Currently, we have the civilian protesters on the ground saying one thing. We have some members of the opposition political grouping saying that they're willing to engage. Hamdok is currently removed from the equation and has warned the military that should a transition not occur, the protesters will not back down. And so I don't think that we can give a definite time frame for when this is going to be resolved. However, I do believe that with greater pressure from multilateral organizations such as the United Nations and the African Union, as well as with the United States coming in and taking a more active role, as well as potentially neighboring countries coming in and engaging, there might be the possibility to fast track this process. Equally, one of the big concerns for the region is the fact that the East African Horn of Africa region is kind of embroiled in some chaos right now with the situation in Ethiopia. So it's imperative for Sudan to find some level of for pressure to be put to bring Sudan back to stability.
Yeah. Talking of stability, what is the economic situation now in Sudan?
The economic situation in Sudan is not great. There have been some sanctions put in place. I hear that the African Union has returned certain sanctions that were lifted with the recent coup that removed Hamdok from office. As a result of this, there's a number of the growth and aspirations that occurred under the credibility of the new transition to democracy, or what was seen as a transition to democracy, are now being removed and revoked, as Sudan is now coming to be viewed as a pariah. To quote an article on Al Jazeera, the fig leaf of democracy and democratization has been removed, and we're now seeing the bare nakedness of authoritarianism in the Sudanese situation.
We appreciate your time, and thank you very much for joining us, Vincent Obisie-Orlu, the researcher at Good Governance Africa, painting a picture for us of a devastating situation in Sudan.